overwhelming majority, we are certainly on the same page and in this conversation looking to move it in the same direction. And as such, we want to just start to clarify just, a couple things right in the beginning. First and foremost, this conversation is not about profitability and margins, right? Margins of profitability. It's about so much more than that. And once we are able to engage the conversation in that space and not make it just an economic argument, now we can start to move into the space where it's a much more valid conversation, and we move into the space where we can actually start to implement solution and find resolution to this problem. Clearly, this is a cultural transformation that we're talking about, and that's what we're looking to apply here. And then ultimately, what are the best ways in which we can do that? How are we currently showing up in our own profession, in our own life, and creating that opportunity for ourselves and others? So that's the conversation here. What does it look like? How can we get into it? And then ultimately, like I said, it's not just an economic conversation. There's so much more to it. And once we start to move into those spaces, that's where we really start to see the value and the direction of this thing. So when we talk about DEI, right, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is a term used to describe programs and policies that encourage representation and participation of diverse groups of people, including different genders, races, ethnicities, those with abilities and disabilities, religions, culture, age, sexual orientation, right? We just want to make sure we are having a diverse and skilled background where we are promoting diversity and inclusion. Ultimately, the research continues to show us, and Alina, you shared an article earlier as we were leading up to this point. It continues to show us that having diverse viewpoints at all levels of an organization will improve their ultimate results, as long as we are not focused strictly on economic feasibility. So what are the other things that are important about this conversation here? To start, profitability is obviously the first and foremost for any business, right? That's the bottom line for all of us. We have to be able to generate, we have to be able to thrive and do well. In that same space, though, there is room for growth, where it doesn't just have to be economic growth. We can start to see growth in productivity, in creativity, in innovation, and just an overall sense of well-being and a desire to be there. Right, and an appreciation for that space, and that's the conversation here. When we talk about the old model, and this is the business model that we're talking about, because, like we said, that's what drives these conversations. We noticed that old model is really based upon creating a majority versus a minority dynamic within a company. It really focuses on maximizing shareholder returns. Right, and that is the paramount, right? The paramount ideal. As we compare that to this newer model that we're walking into, and here's where we can clearly see the difference. We are embracing a much broader vision of success, and this broader vision begins to encompass things like learning, innovation, creativity, flexibility, equity, and obviously human dignity. Leaders continue to acknowledge that increasing these demographic diversity will help increase the effectiveness when an organization harnesses diversity and is willing to reshape its power structure. And in that space, what we're talking about is a commitment to cultural transformation within a company, within an agency, within an organization or an institution. And those are things that, even though they're really nice talking points, right? They're wonderful talking points. And again, that same article that Alina has shared with us, platitudes must give way to sound, empirically based conclusions. Another comment that followed that was say less and do more. The way I normally put it when I'm speaking with individuals, conversation is good, but action is gold. And that's where we want to move this conversation, right? All too often, these conversations get stuck in the halls of academia as a theoretical conversation, but movement is not necessarily its forte. That's not necessarily the result of the conversation. And we want to make sure that these conversations, while rooted firmly in understandings and theory, absolutely are supported by action and movement. Now, when I think about these things, I clearly think about the dynamic that is most apparent here. And that is the replacing of the old guard with the replacing of this new guard. And this is a generational dynamic, and we really start to see that. There is a seismic generational shift that is underway. And we can see that across not just the workforce, but we see that in our social unrest as well, as we've watched that over the last few years here in the United States. What we know about this thing is that older generations, they are organized, and they organize the workplace into hierarchies. And although that was fine for a period of time, and it's still in place now, we're noticing that these younger generations are much more open, much more flexible, and much more fluid in their conversation and their expectation. And as such, they are moving into a place where they are starting to take control, and they are positioning themselves to be in the reins of control. And this younger generation is a sustainability generation. We're starting to notice that they are shaking up the business, the climate, the social culture, the law enforcement conversation. We are seeing them shake up all across the board, and that's a good thing, right? I find it to be a great thing, right? I think change is good. Oftentimes it's painful, but it's always necessary. And as such, we have to be willing to help navigate that conversation as well as help craft the narrative. We certainly don't want to own it, because again, we are that generation that are starting to, and this is how I like to put it, so it's clear and it's plain to understand. We are the guiding force as elders of this community, and the younger generation is the driving force. And when we have the ability to get those two dynamics in place, we can create the greatest amount of results across so many different platforms. Obviously, we're talking about DEI here, but again, business, climate, social culture, law enforcement, civil unrest. We can start to really see where their driving force and our guidance can really start to create the change in which we're discussing here today. And that's the replacing of the old guard, right? We're starting to see that they come with a whole nother set of standards, and they expect their standards to be met, and they are very unforgiving when it's not. You'll start to see an immediate moving away from, you'll start to see an immediate cancel culture. And those things, although I'm not a big fan, right, of the cancel culture dynamic, I do recognize its merit at times. And in those spaces, extremely powerful and impactful. And they create movement and action from the offender. So this is where the conversation really starts to get heavy, and this is where it starts to become important when we start to address the young people of this conversation. As I said, we are that guiding force, and they are that driving force, and we can ignore them at our own peril, especially as business owners, institutions, agencies, and governments. We really want to make sure that we are paying attention to who and what their demands are, and providing them with the pathway and providing them with the opportunity and the reflection with which they are demanding. And that's the conversation behind this DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's all about creating change. And ultimately, we want to make sure it's not the semblance of change. It's not just looking that way, but actually creating the actual change. And in order to do so, they have to accommodate this younger generation. They run the risk of alienation if they continue to ignore them. And what we know about consumers, especially now, we know that consumers are buying in alignment with their values. And that is quickly changing as one generation begins to replace the other. And consumers they expect more than ever from the brands that they buy, that they are increasingly rewarding those companies with their services and products. And they are recognizing that the product and service can't just be good for them, but it has to be good for society. And that's what we're seeing from this younger generation in these demands. And that's what's driving these conversations. What we know is that 66% of all global consumers said that they are willing to pay for sustainable brands. That's a movement in that direction that up until recently, it has not really been a concern. 73% of all global millennials are willing to pay extra for sustainable offerings from diverse brands. This is the generation that is getting ready to replace the older guard. And as such, business, community, dynamic movement will all begin to reflect who and what they are. So that's the conversation, and what we recognize, that's the future, right? That model, the current model right now, that unsustainable economic model, profit first model, profit only model, it's being rewritten, and anyone who is not willing to do so will get left behind, right? As business continues to move forward. So when we talk about the opportunity that this represents, and this is where we start to find ourselves, we start to recognize as educators and instructors and professionals that we have the ability to help teach and drive and guide the conversation, right? And as a result, they are looking to us to come into these places, these workplaces, and have the conversation and teach them how to be more equitable and teach them how to be more fair and honest and responsible in their approach and create cultural transformation within the business. Now, obviously, that can only happen within institutions and agencies and boardrooms who are willing to move forward in that space. If they are not willing to have that as their end result, well, then they're not even willing to have the conversation. Or more importantly, they're willing to have the conversation, just not implement the action. And those are the companies that are going to be held accountable. We are finding them as we continue to speak to them, those who are willing and unwilling. And what we're starting to recognize, those who are unwilling are quickly going to find themselves in trouble, and they already are finding themselves in trouble in terms of their engagement with the community, especially the younger community. We are now in a time where we get to reimagine business in a more fair and equitable way. And in that conversation, we want to do it responsibly. We want to do it where we are educating those who are already in place, while helping those who are coming up to have a much more responsible and impactful role as they start to take over the commitments and responsibilities of those companies. And that's the conversation here. And I mentioned a little bit about this last time. We want to make sure that we are having this conversation twofold. One, those of us who are of the older generation, how we can start to fix things going backwards. And we want to have this conversation as well with the younger generation and teach them how to continue to fix things as they move forward. And it's the convergence of those two dynamics that ultimately create the resolution that we are all looking for, that we are all working for. So again, I leave you with this space, and then we want to open it up for conversation, right? We are the guiding force, and the younger generation are the driving force. And when we have the ability to get that equation right, that's when we create high-level conversations and we help sculpt the progress and the action that takes us there. So with that being said, starting to define this diversity, equity, inclusion piece, where have you been seeing your success, your opportunities? And what are some of the conversations or the roadblocks that you're starting to encounter as you engage these agencies and organizations and individuals who you are responsible to teach? So what does that look like for some of you in your own spaces?
Thank you, Gary. That was a really nice encapsulation of the issue. And I think everyone here has so much experience and is so smart about the issue. I wanted, just like Gary, open this up for conversation. But I first want to acknowledge Colleen. So Colleen is here, and Colleen recently completed her dissertation like this year. So she's a newly minted PhD. But she did her dissertation on an issue. A book is coming out based on her dissertation, right? How is religion killing America? I think that's the title. I'll let you correct me if I got that wrong. But you do a lot of work on diversity, like a lot of your work post-graduation, right, has been on diversity. So could we just hear from you and what you think about the issue?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. And Gary, I really love the fact that you talked about diversity when it came to generational dynamics, because I feel like there is such a call for that to truly merge the generations together, because I see a lot of ideology without implementation. And I think having that merged together would actually perform, it would get us to our goal quicker. So my dissertation, the primary label of it was Exvangelical: Why Millennials and Generation Z Are Leaving the Constraints of White Conservative Evangelicalism. And so my book is actually going to be called Is Christianity Killing America? And my area of diversity, all respect all religious groups, within this area, whether you're religious, non-religious, wherever you stem from. However, from my perspective, what I've seen from conservatism is there's been a lot of drive toward colonization, gentrification, all in the name of conservatism. And so when I looked at the history, I found that a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now when it comes to racism and sexism really stemmed from historical events that were merged with political and also the church during that time period. And they forged this expectation of fundamentalism and traditionalism and really created this hierarchical expectation and standard of what not only the church looked like, but also what society should look like outside of those realms. And so that's what my book really concentrates on, is the idea of how fundamentalism in particular truly created this idea of colonization, of gentrification, and also hierarchy when it came to who is in power, who is in positions of leadership, who is actually set aside, and also how it's created a barrier to us moving forward as a society, regardless of religion background that we come from, on creating a more equitable, diversified, and inclusive society and community. So that's the little spiel about me. But I think I would love to really comment on Gary and your talk and get a little bit of your perspective. I noticed that you said the idea of the older generations kind of coming as that guide and the younger having that driving force. One thing that I've seen in my experience is that older generations truly have a little bit more ability to have that driving force compared to younger, because of the networks, the connections, and also because we live in a very hierarchical society still, that power position. And so how have you seen the idea of older generations sort of merging between that drive and guidance and sort of having a little bit more of that gray area when it comes to all generations working together, to maybe have a little bit of a drive and a little bit of guidance, regardless of generation or regardless of age range?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I certainly appreciate it. Personally, as I've seen that dynamic play out, I continue to see it play out exactly in the wrong direction. When I think about older generations, they hold on to some of the same norms and values that they grew up with, and they refuse to let it go. And it does not serve us as we continue to move into the future. They're holding on to oftentimes old, antiquated thoughts and values and systems and things that are already in place, right? When we think about our law enforcement, there is still an overwhelming influence from the Jim Crow era. How far do we have to get past that before they let it go? Like how far? And we are still seeing that, right? I continue to pass laws and help rewrite laws here in New York that are firmly rooted in those things. And we're in 2021. Exactly how long do we have to get past, like I said, to let them go? So I think the dynamic, when I see it, I see oftentimes these older generations still holding on to too much of that. And this is why I describe them as guiding forces. Certainly there's definitely the potential for the driving force from the older generation, because like you mentioned, they are currently occupying those positions of power. But we are approaching a dynamic where that is quickly starting to become undone. I am seeing that across the board in a lot of different ways. And as such, I recognize it's only a matter of time before we move much more, much more honestly and heartfelt into this space. and then start to yield those results, right, for everybody, including society. So as I see it, I still see it firmly rooted, and I see that thing as still very much a problem. It's only through education and through this influx of just, I like to call it young blood, right? Young energy, that youthful energy that's kind of joining the workforce and the workplace. Not only are they coming in with just a tremendous amount of energy and desire, but they are also coming in, like I said earlier, with an absolute, just a demand for things to be different, right? And as such, we must answer that. So that's how I continue to see it play out. And with a lot of the work I do with younger people, I continue to see their disappointment in the workplaces and the systems that still exist that they have to dismantle or redefine or reimagine in some way, shape, or form. The only difference is that they are doing it at a much faster clip and at a much faster rate, right? Especially over the last 10 years, you can see dynamic change across a bunch of boards. So I'm totally for that in that sense. And this is where, this is where I take my responsibility absolutely the most serious. I recognize my ability in this space to guide the conversation as well as drive the conversation at moments. So I honor that. And I take a lot of time to teach young people how they can get into the space. I take a lot of time to have these conversations so they know what they're looking at and what they need to address as they move forward. So that, again, just like I mentioned earlier, their best step forward, fixing the situation from bottom up, right? Where we fix the situation from top down. That's the dynamic. I still see that in place. I still see that thing happening. And here is where ultimately, and this is where ultimately the conversation lies, right? And I'm always careful when I speak to groups like this, right? Because I'm sure there are a lot of academics in here. Oftentimes the academic conversation just remains theoretical. It remains talk. And we can't, if we're looking to create that dynamic change in the world we live in, we have to be willing to move forward into those spaces of action. Oftentimes that's the part that ruins a good conversation, right? Like we were having a great time just talking about stuff, and then you had the nerve to ask me to do something. Now it's like I'm totally offended. So we have to be able to step into that space and recognize, no, there's a commitment here that we must honor, all right? Not just for ourselves, but for the future generation. Like I think it is a saying, I don't even remember how long ago I learned this thing, right? But we're only borrowing this world until we have to give it back to these younger generations. So be a great steward when it's your turn, and then give it up and give them a better, something better to deal with when it's their turn. That's not exactly the dynamic I see. I certainly make that, a priority in my life and my teachings and those things that I do. I make sure that I'm writing a small business pledge, right? That identifies, the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, that demands we move forward as a company. And as we do so, we're doing so in an equitable space. We are highlighting individuals who are formerly incarcerated. We are highlighting women. We are highlighting minority candidates. We want to make sure that we are in a space to not just talk about the problem, but actually show them from example what that should look like. And each one of us has that responsibility in our own dynamic and in our own professions, in our own, place of business. And that's the conversation here today. What are we willing to do to step up into that place of action? How do we create that so others can see that? And then how do we support them as they are doing it in their own spaces? And ultimately, that's where I enter the conversation, and that's how I enter the conversation. Always towards a point of action, resolution. At the end of the day, like I said, conversation is good, but action is gold. And that's the thing that must be. See, I'm just looking at the chat here. How do you see technology and design coming into play? Bias and old tropes. Look, technology and design, that's a great conversation. It's a wonderful conversation, Ria, right? Thank you for that. oftentimes in the design process, we have to be very conscious and aware of the bias in the design process. This way, the results of that aren't still coming up in some type of bias or bigoted fashion. So it's the responsibility of those individuals designing those things, right? You're designing software, or you're designing applications that allow us, to identify the better points of the conversation, how to get through that. And in those spaces, I'm always for that, right? As an engineer, technology is the best, right? I love it. We are the makers of society, builders of society, right? So I'm always for that because it's so helpful, and we're moving into that space, right? We're not moving forward without tech. So how do we make that work for us? And that's the conversation. And those individuals in that space have to be really responsible, that they're not just addressing the conversation, but they are designing things that are also free of bias in the design, right? And for those people who are in the tech and design space, feel free to please unmute, share that conversation, share that dynamic and your experience in that space, right? For those of you who are here.
So Gary, I noticed there was a question from Barbara and Jed as well. Jed asked you for the sources of the statistics that you gave earlier. So if you have statistics, Jed, are you okay if Gary put it in the LinkedIn page, and then everyone can? Yeah.
Yes. Also, could we get a recording of this conversation?
Yes. So I've made a point to send a recording to people who registered for the event. So I'll send it to you as well. And then Barbara has always great questions. So she said, are there examples of actions that people have taken that you found noteworthy, important, instructive, or maybe even effective? Are there examples that we can follow?
So in that space, I think as I deal in this space, those examples are always custom, right, to the company I'm talking to, or the individual I'm talking to, the organization I'm talking to. Ultimately, it's always about representation. That's always the first thing that they're always concerned with, right? They want to make sure that they have a solid representation in that space, and then from there, allow all of those all of the benefits, from a diverse representation to infiltrate their organization, right? And to have that inclusivity from top down when you look at the organization, and then ultimately, as you see the positions of power in an organization, they are also starting to get filled, right, by non-older white men, because ultimately that's the dynamic here that we're talking about, right? Up until now, that has moved and created and defined most roles in most aspects of society. And we are now starting to see different faces. As I look across the faces just here in the Zoom room, right? Wonderfully diverse audience. This is what the power structures inside of corporations and organizations are starting to look like. And as they do, it's starting to change the dynamic and the conversation and the inclusivity and the happiness and the results that individuals are starting to yield in their business. I'll go ahead and share something because it's not, as we have this conversation, this is really a leadership conversation, right? That's what it is. Those in leadership have to do better. They have to be better stewards, not just of their business, but of their employees, of society, of the planet. And that's the conversation here. I'm going to go ahead and share an excerpt. It's titled Leadership Today. Leadership today cannot be the same as the existing model. The business as usual approach is unsustainable and needs to change. The definitions of success and leadership in our society up until now have been very masculine in nature. They are embodied as economic growth and financial profit through aggressive tactics that benefit the few over the many. That approach is not working and it's not healthy. And today we suffer a crisis of inequality. Our next leaders need to exhibit an understanding that their moral compass needs to be driven by their ability to contribute to the social impact of society. They are not just responsible for profit. They also must consider the impact on people and the planet, wellness and well-being. Their leadership must be transparent and accountable to the next generation. Our next leaders must embrace their masculine and feminine values and encompass the spectrums of age, ethnicity, and sexuality. Now that excerpt, it comes towards the tail end of my book, Unjustified, Where Have Our Black Leaders Gone? That conversation there is the conversation that we're having, and it's a leadership conversation. Certainly diversity, equity, inclusion are part of that conversation, but that's the conversation there. We are moving away from just concern for profit and economic growth, and we are recognizing that there is a commitment and a responsibility for the well-being of ourselves and others and the planet. And we're starting to see that this younger consumer base, as they start to define their consumer power, their purchase power, they are demanding it. And we must provide it to them. Otherwise, we will find ourselves right at the very short end of that stick. And at the bottom line, again, when we talk about business, the bottom line of business, we have to accommodate our clients, and that is what they are demanding at this point. So I think that's where the conversation really starts to drive. And as we move into the leadership portion of this conversation, and we recognize the leadership aspects of this conversation, that's where those of us who are in positions of power, those of us who have the ability to influence those who are in positions of power, that's where we find our greatest opportunity to have the greatest effect in this conversation, in this space. Richard, you had mentioned that you wanted to add something. I just want to give you the opportunity.
Oh, no, I appreciate that, by the way. I'm going to take 10 seconds to get to the point that I want to make. I walk a very interesting line. I'm old enough to remember whites only colored fountains or water fountains. But I have two children of color. And they have to listen to an interesting, they're walking the line from the old school to the new school. And it breaks my heart right now what's going on with CRT. Because I think the DEI movement and the ESG movement and CRT, tell me if my thinking is wrong on this, is being sold incorrectly. Yeah. Because the DEI movement and ESG and CRT is the criticism on a daily basis. You're telling me I'm a bad person. And it breaks my heart because CRT is a very valuable tool. Diversity and inclusion is an invaluable tool to correct the system that's broken. And I think we can all agree that the system is broken. How much can we change the conversation and say the system's broken? Not you. I'm not calling you a bad person. The system's broken. Can we work together? And I'm going to criticize one thing. I think if we sell this right, the DEI and the ESG and the critical race theory, it's profitable for everyone. I don't think we should downplay the profitability of these movements. Everyone is going to profit both socially, emotionally, and economically. Am I right or wrong in that? Let's not shy away from the fact the system's broken and we can profit by changing the system. Everybody can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The operative word, Richard, I think is everyone, right? So everyone. Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that, Richard. Right? I think that's an accurate assessment, and again, you're recognizing the opportunity in that space. So when we're having this conversation, we don't want to eliminate profitability. We just want to recognize that that's just one of the factors and not the primary factor anymore, which is what it used to be, right? In certain places, it still very much is, right? But we're starting to see that shift away from some of that. And we want to continue to shift away from that, right? I know for myself, and this is in just my own personal experience, I've never created any of my businesses with the primary intent, this thing has to be a money maker. And then after that, we can see what else we can do. I've always created my businesses as to create some measure of social impact, recognizing that the financial compensation I would receive, that would just be a byproduct of offering an outstanding value proposition, right? So that's how I've always approached it. So I've always done really well, but it's almost like as a second thought. But that's for me, right? That's how I approach it, because I recognize there are so many other things that are much more important than just the money I make out of what I do. So I always approach it in that space first and foremost, but definitely recognizing profitability. Like I said, that's the bottom line for every business. You must be profitable. Otherwise, you just have a really expensive hobby or whatever it is you're doing, right? So I honor that and I recognize that. And at the end of the day, listen, the money we bring in, that is the lifeline of our businesses, our agencies, our organizations, our institutions. To stay alive, we must bring in money. We just want to make sure that we are, just like I mentioned, emphasizing the other aspects of the conversation that are just as important. When we start to talk about CRT now, right, the critical race theory, they go hand in hand. And this is where we have to be so much smarter in the conversation. Because not only is CRT part of that conversation, so is restorative justice. That's also hand in hand with all of these things. We're talking about creating a healing and more opportunity for others, and redefining and transforming the cultural dynamic that allowed, right, the practice of these inequalities to exist and grow and flourish. So all of those have to be taken into account. And when we do so, that's where we can start to have a much more responsible conversation. It's not an easy thing to do, because ultimately these conversations, they're almost defined before we even get them. Does anybody recognize that? Like, we come to this conversation, DEI is already a thing and we're already using it. Already. The critical race theory is already defined and we're already divided along two different, sections of the conversation for the most part. Already. What we have to do, and this is the responsibility of us individually, we have to recognize that we have to start changing the definition of things. And it starts by how people and things define us. We must start to define ourselves differently. We have to stop defining ourselves by the definitions of others. And when we do so, we can start to recognize, hey, there's an opportunity to have a bigger conversation here, even though it's not the one that's been outlined for me to step into. There is space here where I can get into the conversation and recognize, hey, CRT is part of what we're talking about here. Restorative justice, right? Creating those dynamics and that healing component. So this way, when we finish the conversation, we're actually moving forward with positive movement and in a healing space. We're growing forwards and giving back, right? Those are all opportunities. And this is where we have to start to redefine the conversation. Even with DEI, I am not a fan. Move those letters around. DIE. And that's how they feel about us and this conversation. I'm not sure about, look, everybody's here old enough to remember. So 9/11 goes down. We go into Iraq and they classify the mission as Operation Iraqi Liberation. Oil. We're going to Iraq for oil. There is a reality to the conversation as defined before we get there. And we have to be aware of those dynamics. So this way we don't just play into the same conversation, the same stereotype, the same trope, the same dividing lines that we hold up in place during the conversation because someone else has been defining it for us. So in those moments, I'd really like, and this is how I approach the conversation. It's the same way I do with my children when they came back from school. And my children are now graduated from college, right? But when they came back from elementary school, even high school, we went through a period of unlearning because I knew everything that they were receiving was not in their best interest. And it didn't even line up exactly with actual history, like actual factual things. So we would unlearn, and then we would go ahead and learn what it is they picked up from school and brought home from school. So this way they could understand, hey, look, this is what you need to pass a class, and this is what you need to be successful in life and honest in life so you can see things accurately and honestly. And it's those portions of the conversation. CRT is part of it. Let's have it responsibly. It doesn't have to be a dividing issue. It could just be, these things are mutually exclusive, and that's how they're presented to us. And then we start having the conversation as though there are one one line of thought or another line of thought, critical race theory, CRT. And we want to make sure that we are not doing that. Don't allow others to define you or this conversation. We must be responsible to have this conversation in a bigger capacity. And recognizing that CRT is part of it, recognize restorative justice as part of the conversation. That's when we start to get the most out of this thing. And we redefine it according to how we need it and not how others tell us it is. I see the chat moving. I just haven't had a chance to read it. So let's look at some of that. Newbie here, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, CRT, critical race theory. All right, so those are some of the easy questions I've seen there. Alina, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say that ultimately the definition depends on what you define as the outcome. Right. So if you define the outcome as increasing diversity, and then you could increase diversity, but not really move the needle in terms of equity and inclusion. Right. So the definition, I think, is important in that the more accurate your outcome is, or the more, the clearer you get on the outcome, and if you avoid things like purpose washing and diversity washing and all that, then you start moving the needle in terms of inclusion and equity, right? But if you have this vague idea about, diversity is good and therefore more diverse people in my organization equals good, that's not going to move the needle anywhere.
No, I would also add that diversity for the sake of diversity will kill your business. Right. So at the end of the day, run your business like a business. That's first and foremost. You be unapologetic about running your business. And in that space, find ways to be inclusive and helpful and diverse and equitable. But don't just be diverse, equitable, or inclusive just for the sake of it, because at the end of the day, you must be profitable so you can become sustainable. And it's that long-term approach and presence that allows you to create, right, the opportunity or the impact that we're talking about here. So yeah, it's part of it, right? But in and of itself, by itself, and that, the article that you shared with us, Alina, it spoke about that, right? Diversity for the sake of it, that doesn't do it. The research does not support the conversation, and it's right because it doesn't. You can't just be diverse for the sake of it. It has to be intentional and diverse. Right? But you must be intentional about this thing. So you're putting the right people in the right places. You're promoting diversity when you can, when it best suits the company's interest. But ultimately, you have to do it responsibly because we have to make money. The last thing I want to do is give $1 to everybody and end up broke. Right? That helps no one. And that's not the conversation we're having here. And it's not the one that I recommend or support.
So I want to move to Barbara to see if you had any thoughts. I always love hearing what you have to say, but don't feel pressured. If
thoughts, thoughts like random thoughts, yeah. But let's see. That's almost as bad as Gary's. Like, yeah, you want my random thoughts, but no action. Yeah, but I guess I'm at the precipice of making a little bit of action happen different places, and just really frustrated by how hard it is. So it's typically on boards, trying to get diverse boards. I think I mentioned before, I'm involved in this long COVID groups, and the patients are disproportionately, more minority people have COVID, and therefore more have long COVID. And because of the way our health system works, people with weird diseases that can't be cured, like long COVID, get ignored generally. And then on top of it, if you're not white, you have an extra layer of people ignoring you and believing you. so it's and I'm in this organization, a not-for-profit. I'm on the board. I'm now vice chair of this board, and we're trying to address this. And everyone on our board, not everyone, but our board is almost all white, because we come out of this same world, and getting figuring out how to network into completely different worlds, to get a flow of people who actually care about what you're doing and want to be part of it, is not easy. So we're, I'm actually, you might be able to tell, I am somebody who enjoys networking with people. I enjoy reaching out to people. I don't mind asking them. And so making a little bit of progress, but it's a world where everyone is being asked these questions, and people who are in business and are interested, or people who have an interest in board service or being an advisor, they're all inundated with either people asking them for referrals, people, they're suspicious that you're just calling them up out of the blue. Why didn't you call me last year? When I wanted to fill up my board card last year, and now I've got 6 million offers from organizations, and I don't know which one to trust. And so I think it's been extremely difficult. Now, that said, it's way easier now than it was. If I tried to do this 2 years ago, it would not have been easier. Let me put it that way. There's more, you don't have to explain to people now why we want a more diverse board. You don't have to explain to, people why it's wrong, that the fact that there is unequal access to medical care and all that stuff. It's a lot more believed, but it still doesn't make it easy. That's my rant.
Hey, Barbara, this is great. This is Michael Mann. I'm so glad to be here. I'm in healthcare advisor startup and founder. And I would love to connect you offline with do you guys have a selection for like a patient advocate on your board? Do you do that periodically? I know an amazing person that could be very helpful of diversity for you.
Fantastic. Yes, we are a patient advocacy organization and a research organization. So absolutely.
Is there a specific disease that you guys focus on?
Yeah, ours is on ME/CFS and long COVID. So are these post-viral unexplained diseases that for the first time have actual funding available to try to make some progress on research that has been ignored for decades.
Well, I need to connect you. A good buddy of mine's Meta Diver. She has a company, Miami, that does everything on autoimmune disease. And then Sandra Washington, anyway, we'll do it offline, but that's why we're here, to have a conversation. So love this anyway. Awesome.
Terrific. Thank you.
So Michael, I'm not sure if this is your LinkedIn link, but I put it down here for Barbara.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm almost full. I apologize. I'm at that 30,000 limit that they cap yet for LinkedIn. So pretty close to that, but this is great. So yeah, please connect with me, Barbara. Love what you're doing. So important. And
yeah, it looks like we're already connected. I'm in there. I think it looks like Michael Mann, MHA.
Yeah, Michael Mann.
Yeah.
But just
I'm one of your thousands. So
no, you're number one. You're number one. You are number one.
I love this, especially when you get to connect with people with like interest. That's great. Yeah. So Michael and Barbara do connect, and I want to make sure that I'm respecting of everyone's time. So I will just reshare my slides real quick, and then take everyone to the end of the session. I want to say thank you for your comments. Thank you, Gary, for coming in and speaking. But as I was preparing for this event, so some of you might know that my background is in copyright law, And when I think about diversity, I know there's, you need to be aware of the issue as an individual. You need to be aware of the issue as an organization, and as a country, as a nation, and globally as well, right? And the discussion that I think is so important. So Gary's given us a lot of the conversation that needs to happen. I think the next question that many of us are struggling to find the answer to is, well, how do we, now that we know what the conversation is, how do we actually make that happen, right? And so we know what diversity looks like, we know what equity looks like, we know what inclusion looks like theoretically, right? So intellectually we have an idea of what that would look like, and I guess morally we all know that this is a good thing, right? This is something that we need to do, and and we can talk about whether it's going to affect profits or not on a separate conversation, right? But as a moral ethical, from a moral ethical perspective, we know this needs to happen. So I want to give you an idea of what I think equity and inclusion might look like, and some ideas of how that might roll out on a practical level. So you all know Raya. Raya is this cartoon that came out from Disney very recently. And the cultural, I guess the background of Raya is she's from Southeast Asia, right? This is a Southeast Asian culture. And as some of you may know, I'm originally from Malaysia. I'm in Mississippi now, but I'm originally from Malaysia. And so when I watch this, it brings back a lot of memories, but also evokes quite a bit of emotions, right? So when we talk about diversity, we see Disney moving, like in their output, right? The outcome, the movies that they're producing, we see them moving towards a more diverse, I guess product line, right? With their movies, right? And starting from 1992 with Pocahontas, right? The Disney princesses have looked more diverse, but that's in the output, right? But when we talk about outputs, we also need to think about the steps that we put in the process, right? Or Richard was saying the system that's going to result in the output, right? And so back to Raya, I looked at the people who actually produced Raya. There was only 2 people who were of Asian descent, right? And everyone else was American. One of the screenplay writer was actually a Malaysian woman, right, who grew up in a school that's actually quite close to my school, who then went on to LA and then wrote Crazy Rich Asian. You might know that movie. But she is the only Southeast representation. She and another Vietnamese screenwriter were the only Asian representation in Raya. So what might equity and inclusion look like? I think there are so many culture in Southeast Asia that you see in the cartoon, right? So this dragon here does look a lot like what was the dragon's name in Raya? The dragon, right? The dragon in Raya. But there was no acknowledgement, interestingly enough, and I've watched Raya from front to back like 5,000 times because of my daughter, right? There was no acknowledgement of where that culture came from, right? There was no, what would have been really great is if Disney interviewed someone from their culture, right? To talk about the movie. That would be inclusiveness, right? Because the what we are getting from Disney is Disney's portrayal or Disney's understanding of the culture, right? From an external viewpoint, right? But the voice, I think there was someone in the chat, I think it was Richard, right, who said something about you need to have a voice, right? And the voice from these different cultures doesn't come across in the movie, right? And when we talk about equity, Disney has all these distribution channels that a lot of these cultures do not have access to, There is no way there's different cultures. And I'm not just talking about Ray, I'm talking about the different cultures that make up the different, these diverse Disney princesses. They don't have these cultures do not have the distribution channel that Disney has, right? And if Disney was committed to social impact, one of the things that they would consider doing is providing that distribution channel for authentic culture to come across, right? So that's one thing that I that I thought about when thinking about the subject. So those are thoughts that I wanted to leave you with. Most of you here already by now know our mission, right? Really to bridge academics with social impact work, and hopefully have an impact fund that can fund impact work. So those are all long-term goals, and this will be in the slides that I will put up on the event page. And also to invite you to the events that we have planned that's going to run to the end of August. So on July 26th, a good friend, Yuri Van Rensburg, is going to come to talk about raising funds for social impact. And then August 9th, we're going to talk about intellectual property as the revenue generating strategy for impact-based organizations, right? And a lot of you would know that my background is in IP. And then on the last event, we're going to try to pull all these ideas together and talk about how to build a successful social enterprise. And hopefully for the next couple of sessions, we'll try to do it more roundtable style to get more discussion going. So I want to say thank you, and see you in 2 weeks' time. All right.
Thank you, everybody. Wonderful conversation today. And remember, just put it into action, whatever it is you're doing, because at the end of the day, we stack our wins and we continue to move forward. There were a couple questions I didn't get to answer out of the chat. For anybody who wants to get at me, by all means, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn at Gary O'Valley and the other social media, and Gary at GaryO'Valley.com. You can always reach out to me there through my email. Again, I know it looks fancy, but it's just Gary, GaryO'Valley. You can certainly reach out to me that way as well. Dr. Colleen, I would love to conversate with you. That was pretty awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.